Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ghost in the Machine in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, of the Ancient City Ruins. A jumbled stream of fragmented sights and sounds flickered by, streaked with static and pixeled out blotches of corrupt data. Shrapnel. Boiling air. A bass rumble that rattled bones and shook the earth. A high-pitched, keening screech melded with the basso roar of a giant beast. A flash of blinding white light. Heaven and earth in a spiral, rushing to trade places with one another. Rushing wind howling as clipped metal wings caught vortices of air. Ground approaching faster and faster and commencing system check. Memory unit, green. Hey there. Are you alright? Gosh, you look hurt. Here, it'll be alright. What's your name? That's okay, take your time. Chara, huh? That's a nice name. My name is. Initializing tactics log. Loading geographic data. Vitals, green. Remaining MP, 100%. Alaris, do you think she is? Black box temperature, normal. Black box internal pressure, normal. Activating IFF. What is this? Are there, two? Activating FCS. Initializing pod connection. Statement, unable to establish a connection to the bunker. Proposal, find a position free of signal interference. Launching DBU setup. Activating inertia control system. Activating environmental sensors. 2B, are you alright? 2B. Equipment status, green. All systems green. Combat preparations complete _. Yoarha Unit 2 Type B, Utler, 2B squeezed herself free of the wreckage of her mangled flight unit, setting foot on the grassy, flower-dotted soil coating the ground. Command won't be pleased, she thought as she glanced back at the hunk of twisted metal she'd had to wrench her legs out of. The boys in the hangar bays pitched a fit if one returned a flight unit with so much as a scratch on its hull. She stood in a cavernous grotto, the only light coming from a small aperture in the ceiling dozens of meters above, filtering through the thick air and illuminating floating motes of dust. Yellow flowers with wide, bright petals fluttered at her feet, disturbed by her landing. On the other side of the cavern stood crumbling pillars, a weathered and eroded brick wall, and a yawning, arched doorway. Torches lined the doorway but offered scant illumination. 2B's recent memories were in fragments, possibly due to trauma from the crash, but from the wreckage strewn around the cavern it seemed she'd sheared off a wing of her flight unit while flying through the hole. What strange behavior. She didn't remember being shot down. What reason had 2B needed to diverge from her course and abandon her squadron? There was a Goliath-class machine on the other side of the mountain she and her companion had been set to engage. Her companion. 2B. Yoarha Unit 9 Type S, Kenner, 9S laid a gloved hand on her shoulder. Any damage? I may be experiencing some memory corruption, she replied, shrugging away his hand as she brushed soot and dust off her elegant black dress and made sure the sword at her side was still in one piece. With an experimental swing she made certain her near-field combat programs were fully functional. However, physically, I think I'm unharmed. 2B noticed much to her surprise that her counterpart, the silver-haired Nines, stood in front of his own flight unit, which was not in pristine condition but still looked plenty flight-capable to her. You didn't crash here with me, she pointed out to him. Nines cringed, visibly uncomfortable. His eyes were hidden by his black cloth visor, as were 2B's, but she could see the embarrassment written all over his face. His support pod, Pod 153, floated by his side at eye level, the black hull of its boxy body catching what little light filled the cavern. From the way its manipulator arms flexed, if it were humanoid, it would be wringing its hands. Well, Observation, Yoarha Unit 9's abandoned his position, Pod 153 interjected in its cool female voice, once Unit 2B's flight unit crashed. Perhaps he wished to guarantee your own safety foremost over engaging with the Goliath. 2B frowned. It was a sweet gesture, and certainly heroic, but not the kind of action permitted to Yoarha androids. Perhaps the androids in the Resistance could get away with such tomfoolery, but better was expected from such elite models as Nines and 2B. Before continuing with the mission, Nines hastily added, of course. Statement, Yoarha Unit 9 has retreated from battle against orders, and as such is now a deserter, Pod 042, 2B's own support pod, answered. Proposal: 9s should be prosecuted for dereliction of duty. The recommended sentence is execution. Execution. The word stung 2B's ears. The commander, she replied coolly, waving Pod 042 away, will decide his fate. With the barest hint of a wry smile, she added, perhaps if he distinguishes himself in battle, his punishment will be lighter. Well, then, let's not waste any more time down here. 9s brushed a bit of debris off the shoulder of his short black coat and led 2B to his flight unit. Come on. We've got machines to kill. This course of action is not recommended, Pod 153 pointed out as it drifted alongside 9s. It is unsafe to fly 2 per flight unit. If 2B wished to do things by the book, it would have been recommended, admirable even, to detain 9s, whether by incapacitating or terminating him, and simply take his flight unit for herself to complete the mission. But the last thing 2B wanted to do was kill her partner. Not now, not ever. Oh, hey. Howdy. You two aren't trying to leave, are ya? 2B and 9s both zeroed in on the source of the saccharine, sickly sweet voice emanating from down at their feet. Down there was a rather large flower that just about came up to 2B's thigh, plain with big yellow petals. Beyond belief, a humanoid face was set within it, smiling with little crinkles at the corners of its eyes. 9s whacked at the side of his head a few times. 2B, is there something wrong with my visual processor? If there was, then somehow 2B was suffering from the same exact fault. But she couldn't explain what she was seeing. The only intelligent life forms on the planet were androids like her and whatever nebulous alien intelligence lorded over the hordes of machine life forms rampaging over the surface. There were no humans and certainly no sentient talking plants. It was said the alien mothership had buried itself underground. But this couldn't be the form the aliens had taken, could it be? There are no faults detected within Yoarha Unit 9's visual processor, said Pod 153. You four are awfully funny, you know that. The flower smiled. I'm Flowey. Flowey the flower. What are your names? 9s chuckled. This guy's for real, he half whispered to 2B. We don't have time for this, 2B sternly reminded him. We've got to return to the surface, 9s, why don't you go up and call for backup? Flowey's petals drooped. Oh. Well, I hate to break it to ya, but, you guys can't just leave. 9s drew his own sword, the bronze blade cruel oath. That sounds like a threat. Choose a fact, Flowey said apologetically. Why see, there's a magical barrier over this whole mountain. Anyone can come in, but it's not so easy to get out. Magic. 2B scoffed. There is, Pod 153 said, an unidentifiable energy field over the aperture we traveled through. Sensors also detect background radiation consistent with traces of old-world magic. This unit cannot verify any further claims by this organism without additional data. I mean, you could try to fly out, Flowey said, but you'd probably blow yourselves up. He peered up at 9s, straining his stem against the soil. If he had feet, he'd be standing on his toes. How about I show you how things work down here? Why see, we're all about love here, and we share that love through little white, friendliness pellets. A ring of little white motes materialized around the flower. Wouldn't you? I don't care. 2B brusquely pushed Flowey aside but felt a jolt of pain shoot through her hand as a pellet brushed against it. Interference washed through her visual subsystems in response, causing her HUD to flicker and distort for a moment. By instinct, 2B drew her sword and lashed out with superhuman android reflexes. Yikes. Flowey shot back underground just milliseconds before he would have been decapitated and popped out a few meters away, his cutesy visage replaced with a toothy, feral snarl. Got some fight in you, eh? I like it. A bolt of fire, its color a strange pale lavender, cut through the air, scaring the malevolent flower away. Begone, foul creature. The flower vanished underground once again and did not return. 2B honed in on whoever had thrown that fireball, readying her blade, and found herself face to face with a creature nearly as unbelievable as a talking flower. It was a humanoid creature, tall with a somewhat heavy-set, feminine body obscured beneath faded and tattered violet robes. It had alabaster white fur, paws like a bear's, and the head of a goat. In one upraised paw, a ball of pale violet fire writhed and roiled, lighting up the beast's face. "Greetings, children. I am Toriel, the caretaker of the ruins." She had a kindly, grandmotherly voice. "I do so hope that beastly weed was not tormenting." Her voice trailed off. "Children, would you kindly set aside your weapons? I mean you no harm." 2B and Nines shared a suspicious glance between the two of them before sheathing their swords. Pod 153 chimed in. "Proposal: more information should be collected from the creature known as Toriel." Oddly, flowers and vines grew all over the ruins, green and lively despite the lack of sunlight. The ecosystem was, like 2B and 9SS support pods wasted no time in pointing out, absolutely nonsensical. Of course, magic needed not to make sense. That was why it was called magic, and not science. The creature known as Toriel had a house deep in the dark, maze-like ruins remarkably similar to the kinds of houses 2B and 9s had seen on the surface of the earth, albeit much more well-kept. As soon as 2B and 9s stepped over the threshold into Toriel's gloomy abode, she bade them sit at the dining room table. The two androids' support pods, not ones for idle chatter, retreated to the corner of the room to share data silently among themselves. Toriel set saucers in front of both androids. "Would you two like some tea? I'm so sorry, children, I haven't caught your names yet. As I have said, I am Toriel, caretaker of these ruins, and you are?" "Yoarha units 9s and 2B, 9s responded. "Nunis and 2B." Toriel stroked her muzzle. "What strange names you children have these days. Anyway, tea, is there a blend either of you would prefer?" "I have chamomile, echinacea, Earl Grey, ginseng." "We require nothing to drink," 2B said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "We'll have Earl Grey," said 9s. 2B was nonplussed as Toriel trundled off into the kitchen. 9s crossed his arms and put up his feet. "Proposal: even unneeded hospitality should be accepted in the name of information gathering," he said in a pitch-perfect imitation of 2B's Pod 042. "Proposal," 2B fired back, knocking 9S's feet off the table. Putting one's shoes on a table is a grave breach of etiquette. "So," 9s said in hushed tones, leaning in closer to 2B, "what do you think of this?" "I think," 2B answered brusquely, "we'll both be lucky if we aren't branded as traitors and shot on sight when we return to the bunker." 9s. "Be a little more optimistic, ma'am." 2B glared at him beneath her visor. She didn't like when he called her ma'am. It always felt uncomfortably formal and deferential. 2B. "We've found something extraordinary here. Intelligent biological life. This," 9s gestured to the walls with their faded floral wallpaper. "This could change everything. The Council of Humanity needs to know about this." 2B couldn't fault 9s for his enthusiasm. He was a scanner model, after all. It was natural for him to be curious, sometimes too curious. Toriel returned with a pot of tea and 2 small teacups, which she filled in front of her 2 guests. "I do hope I am not intruding. Children, do you prefer butterscotch or cinnamon?" "We don't require cinnamon," 9s replied, taking a sip of his tea. "Thank you, Miss Toriel." "Thank you, dear." Toriel vanished yet again into the kitchen. "Do you feel," 2B asked 9s, "that this creature is stalling us?" "I'm beginning to get the sense. She isn't a machine, but she sure is acting suspiciously." 9s crossed his arms. "You know, I heard that in the old world, humans would tell their children things called fairy tales. These stories would be full of magic and other fantastic elements. Like witches who ate children." He cast a glance back at the kitchen. "Think we might be in one?" 2B hoped not. Artifacts from the old world of humans containing magical energies were vanishingly rare, but when they cropped up, the trouble they could cause rivaled the machines. A magical weapon could cut right through even the strongest electromagnetic field barriers like butter. 2B, I'm, 9s hesitated for a second before resting his chin on his hands. "I'm sorry. I know leaving you behind was the right thing to do, but I couldn't." In the war against the machines, 1 or 2 Yoarha units could change the course of a battle on their own, especially a battler unit as skilled and decorated as 2B. For their allies fighting on the surface, the loss could be enough to turn the tide against their favor, and Nines knew it. 2B could see clearly from his forlorn expression that he felt great remorse for his behavior. Run a diagnostic on your logic circuits, 2B suggested. Errors in decision-making like this may be symptomatic of an early-stage logic virus infection. Nines sighed. Thanks, 2B. You always know what to say to cheer a guy up, don't you? Toriel poked her head out of the kitchen once more. Oh, children, I beg your pardon, but you do not dislike butterscotch, do you? No, 2B answered. Satisfied, the creature retreated yet again. Wait. Nines held up his hand. Would you care to answer a few questions, ma'am? He asked Toriel. Well, I suppose so. The caretaker took a seat at the table adjacent to both Nines and 2B. Ask away. What are you? Nines asked. Toriel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I had assumed that was obvious. I am a monster. Oddly, while the word monster tended to have harsh connotations, she used the label as casually as one would say human or android. I know, she added, you've probably only heard of us in fairy tales and bedtime stories, but that is indeed what we are. And what are you doing here? Nines pressed on. Underground, imprisoned beneath this am I to understand magical barrier. Toriel looked away. Oh. Well, since you asked. What is your connection, 2B butted in, to the machine life forms? The what? Toriel seemed to genuinely not understand 2B's question, and 2B's facial recognition subroutines saw no sign she was lying. Then again, 2B could hardly say she knew what a lying goat looked like. Please, ma'am, Nines insisted. Do go on. Well, Toriel raised a paw to her nubby horns. Many thousands of years ago, a dozen millennia, by my reckoning there was a terrible war, children, between humans and monsters. Our kingdom suffered a horrible defeat, unable to defend itself from human violence, and we survivors were imprisoned using magic arts long since. In mid-sentence, she shot out of her chair, standing bolt upright. Children, do you smell that? 2B and Nines both sniffed the air. Something was burning, judging not just from the acrid smell but the smoke wafting through the kitchen doorway. Oh, dear, the goat woman exclaimed. She rushed to the kitchen, eyes wide with panic. 2B stood up. Come on, she told Nines. Clearly she is wasting our time. Nines groaned and rose to his feet, summoning Pod 153 to his side. He offered it a friendly fist bump as it hovered beside him. Nice going, Tubes, he muttered. You scared her off. Do not call me that ever again, said 2B. Ah, come on. I let you call me Nines. 2B refrained from pointing out that Nines could let her call him Nines all he wanted, she still wouldn't do it. It wasn't that she disliked Nines, quite the opposite, in fact, as he was a loyal and helpful companion through thick and thin, but she didn't want him to think she was that close to him. Doing so would only cause trouble. 2B left the dining room as Pod 042 drifted over to her from its resting place. As she passed by the kitchen with her counterpart and his support pod in tow, she heard Toriel's voice. Oh, egads. My pie is ruined. But what if I were to purchase a store-bought pie and disguise it as my own baking? She chuckled. Delightfully devilish, Toriel. 2B and Nines crept through the house. One room, a bedroom, had an open journal lying on its desk. 2B took a moment to read from the page displayed. Why was the skeleton so lonely? Because he didn't have any body. Think this might be the lady's bedroom? Nines wondered. Pod 042 chimed in. Analysis, long-range scans of the space within this mountain have been completed. Sensors detect 6 black box signals emanating from the center of the mountain. 2B froze. Black box signals, she hissed. The black box was the heart and soul of any Yoarha-type android and, in dire circumstances, a weapon of last resort. Its signal could be used to track the whereabouts of androids anywhere in the world. Why had nobody detected these signals before? Was the apparently magical barrier enclosing this space so strong? Nines looked aghast and turned to his own support pod. Pod, can you corroborate these findings? Observation, independent scans do verify the findings of Pod 042, Pod 153 answered. There are indeed 6 unique signals from your HA-type androids deeper into the mountain. We just might not be in trouble with command, after all, said Nines. He left the bedroom and crept up to a door blocked with thick chains and a heavy padlock. With a swing of his sword, he cut the lock off, then with a careful nudge from his foot swung the door open, revealing a descending staircase in a pitch-black corridor. Solid and radar scans indicate a passage deeper into the mountain through here, Pod 042 pointed out. 2B took the lead and ventured into the basement, her sword in her hands. The corridor stretched on for meters, light from 2B's support pod's beacons casting sharp chiaroscuro shadows across the crumbling stone walls and floor. Up ahead was an ancient stone door, cold air seeping through the cracks between door and wall. If 2B were a human, she would have shivered. Wait. 2B stopped and glanced over her shoulder. Behind her and Nines, panting for breath, stood Toriel. Please, the old monster said, take not a step farther. You do not know what grisly fate awaits you deeper within our kingdom. Step beyond that door and I will not be able to guarantee your safety. The king of Mount Abbot. King Ascari, the old woman shuddered. He is ruthless, merciless, and evil. He will rip the souls from your bodies, just as he has done, she continued, her voice quavering, to every child who has passed through this tunnel. Children. 2B wondered. Please, stay here with me, Toriel pleaded, holding out her arms. I know it is not much here. I know you must miss your homes, your family, your friends. But please, children, nothing awaits you beyond that door but death. The androids did not budge. Fire blazed to life in the goat woman's paws, casting dancing violet shadows across the stone walls of the corridor. Toriel's eyes gleamed, glowing bright red. Prove yourselves to me, then, she said, the globes of fire shifting and morphing into a long and regal scepter. Prove to me, children, you are strong enough to survive in this wicked kingdom. Tongues of flame lashed out, scorching the walls. For a creature who had seemed so old and so matronly, Toriel was shockingly nimble, and 2B and Nines found their swords locked against her staff as the androids struggled to avoid errant bursts of flame. Call me crazy, Nines breathed, leaping backward, but I'm having a hard time justifying hurting this old goat. You're crazy. 2B pressed on, engaging the flame-summoning monster with a flurry of slashes. The fiery scepter dug into 2B's torso, knocking her back, then caught her under her chin, nearly lifting her off her feet. She was sent reeling all the same. Toriel was far stronger than 2B had expected, perhaps even comparable in strength to a machine life form. You wouldn't last an hour out there, Toriel told her. A burst of fire sailed over 2B's shoulder, singeing her silvery white hair. The kingdom I once knew and loved has been gone for generations. 2B drew back her blade for a killing blow, but Toriel pressed on. This time, though, 2B now knew enough about Toriel's attack patterns, speed, and strength not to be caught off guard. She dodged the next few strikes with ease and grace until the fiery scepter's decorative finial crashed into her collarbone. A follow-up strike knocked the virtuous contract from 2B's hand. 2B. Nines cried out. This mountain is a hideous and brutal place. Toriel cried out, a wave of flames emanating from her held-out paw and driving Nines back as he tried to rush to his counterpart's side. I beg of you please, do not go like all the others. Nines threw the cruel oath. The sharp, curved katana blade glittered coppery bronze in the flickering flames before 2B snatched it out of the air. My children. With an elegant, perfectly executed riposte, 2B slid the cruel oath's blade along the length of the lavender scepter and tore it from Toriel's paws. As it left the old monster's grip, the scepter flickered and burst apart into a flurry of harmless sparks. The tip of the blade nicked Toriel's throat, and at that exact moment, the old monster's attacks instantly ceased. 2B's attack, however, did not. The blade kept going, piercing the monster's neck just above her collar. Gouts of blood poured down her violet robes, staining them an even deeper black in the flickering and fading firelight. Toriel gasped and fell to her knees, eyes wide and unfocused, as 2B yanked out the blade. She laughed weakly. Foolish, foolish little queen, she croaked. I should have known. The two of you. Toriel smiled and shook her bowed head. Now I see who I was protecting by keeping you here. Not you, but them. And then Toriel collapsed, her body crumbling into white dust. She left nothing behind but a bleached pile of dust settling atop a stained and ragged violet robe. Pod 042 floated back to 2B's side. Analysis: no further life signs detected from the monstrous life form designated Toriel. Proposal: continue on as direct a route as possible toward the black box signals. 2B handed Nines back his sword and collected her own discarded weapon, sheathing its ivory-colored blade at her side. She pushed the heavy stone door open, letting windswept snowflakes flutter through the aperture on whirling currents of brisk air. Come on, Nines. Let's go. As the brighter light from the door traveled across 9S's face, 2B noticed that he seemed almost morose. 9S. This way. Sorry. It's just that, for a second there, she seemed nice. Nines shook his head. Guess she was just the witch who wanted to bake Hansel and Gretel into a pie all along. As much as she didn't wish to admit it, 2B felt a slight pang of regret as well. Shaking it off, she stepped forward and found herself standing in a forest she may have mistaken for the outside world were it not for the telltale glances of craggy stone peeking out from above thick clouds overhead. Evergreen trees grew tall here, even without the sun to provide their nutrients. And even without the sun, the sky was still somewhat bright, like early morning or early evening in midwinter. Bright enough to still discern the snow from the trees. 2B and Nines pressed onward, leaving the dust-filled ruins far behind. In the distance, hidden behind a bristly conifer, a single golden-yellow flower watched the two androids travel deeper into the snow-sugared forest. Chara, is that you? He asked, his words falling on nobody's ears but his own. Chapter 2, A Wretched Weaponry. 2B and Nines trudged through the thick snow blanketing the ground. At points the path narrowed, growing thin enough that needle-coated branches on both sides brushed against 2B's shoulders and clung to her arms. At other points, the trees grew so far apart that they vanished into the thick snowfall, limiting her visibility. Entranced by the beauty of the surrounding environment, Nines lagged behind while 2B strode down the tree-lined pathway through the alpine forest. 2B had to admit it was beautiful, although she had too much on her mind to take in the scenery as much as her partner. Monsters. An ancient war. 6 captured androids mistaken for humans. Some nonsense about a creature named Ascari collecting human souls, or what he seemed to believe were human souls. It was a lot to process. Something cold and soft hit her in the back. 2B whirled around, sword at the ready, and found Nines crouched down over a snowbank, using his hands to scoop up and mold a rough, misshapen spheroid out of the snow. 9S. What are you doing? It's, Nines sheepishly dropped the ball of snow, brushing errant snowflakes from his gloves. It's something humans used to do in the winter. They'd make little balls of this stuff and throw them at each other. Humans were such strange creatures. 2B turned around and kept going. The next snowball hit her in the back of the head, a shower of frigid snow pouring down her neck and back. 2B looked over her shoulder and saw Nines standing bolt upright, his hands hidden behind his back, trying desperately to keep his face from breaking out in a boyish grin. 9S. Please. 9S's shoulders slumped. Come in, 2B. It's fun. We don't have time for this. 2B turned her attention back to the path in front of her and kept walking. Don't fall behind, 9S. Despite her admonishments, she couldn't help but smile just a little at his antics, although, of course, she'd never let him know that. You wanna know, Nines said, rushing to keep pace with 2B and pulling just slightly ahead of her, what I've always wanted to do once the war's over. 2B nodded. I believe you called them snow angels. Yeah, Nines froze, his mouth agape in surprise. Hey, I don't remember telling you about that. Of course you did. 2B passed by him once again. She grabbed a gnarled pine branch and bent it out of her way as the trail narrowed yet again. Just a few months ago, when we were. 2B, I just got assigned to you last month. Alarmed at her slip of the tongue, 2B cut herself off. I mean, she lied, I must have overheard it from somebody at the bunker. Your operator, perhaps. Well, that's rude, Nines huffed. I told that to 210 in confidence. Who was she blabbing that to? He stomped his way past her, grumbling all the while, but once he'd gotten about a meter ahead of 2B he suddenly plunged into the snow all the way up to his shoulders. 2B took her time to assist her beleaguered partner, carefully testing each step she took to avoid plunging into a sinkhole herself as their two support pods floated down and grabbed Nines by his arms. Don't you laugh, Nines admonished her. I would not dream of it, 2B assured him as she crouched down and reached under his armpits to help the pods haul him up. Looks like you guys could use a hand, said a short, stocky, completely bald man in a ragged blue winter coat who had somehow appeared out of the forest right by 2B's side without her noticing. 2B looked again. No, he wasn't a bald man. He was a skeleton. There was not a trace of flesh or sinew on him, or at least none 2B could see. Despite his total lack of ligaments, all of his bones seemed quite soundly connected to each other. Yet another strange denizen of this equally strange underground realm. 2B paid the biological impossibility no mind as she did her part to free Nines. Thank you, kind sir, she told him, but we do not need any help. The skeleton coughed into his sleeve. No, I said you could use a hand. 2B and the pods hauled Nines out of the sinkhole, sliding him onto higher ground. The snow was thick and wet and clung to the poor android's coat and shorts. 9's clothes were left soaked through as patches of snow sloughed off. Nines reached out for the skeletal stranger's hand and grabbed it. Dunno who you are, but thanks, pal. The skeleton's bony phalanges and metacarpals tore away from his wrist, leaving Nines holding the disembodied hand in his own. In her surprise, 2B let go of Nines, and in his surprise, Nines would have slipped back into the sinkhole were it not for the pods still supporting him. You can have that one, said the skeleton. It's on me. He held up his other hand. Well, actually, this one's on me. That one's on you. Statement, said Pod 153. That was a practical joke. The skeleton chuckled. Nice to meet you four. The name's Sans. Sans, huh. Nines stood up and brushed the remaining snow off his coat, still clutching the Sans hand. Well, I'm Nines, and this is 2B. Our pods here are 042 and 153. Wow. Your parents were really creative, huh? A little light twinkled in the Sans skeletal eye sockets. Seriously, though, fun and games aside, I actually need that hand back. Oh. Sorry. Nines handed the hand back to Sans. Say, you two aren't humans, are you? He asked as he snapped the hand back onto his wrist, cracking his knuckles. Of course not, 2B answered. Oh, all right, good. That'll make things a lot easier for you guys. Me, I don't really follow the trends, Sans said, shrugging, but my brother? He's a human hunting fanatic. Human hunting? Was that what happened to the other Yoarha androids? 2B wondered. Has he caught any? Nines asked. What? Of course not. There hasn't been one down here in years. Actually, do you think you could do me a favor? Sans asked. My brother's been a little down in the dumps, and he'd really love it if you two pretended to be human for just a little bit. It'd really cheer him up. We're sorry, 2B answered without the slightest hesitation, but we are in a hurry. We can't afford to indulge your brother. She pressed onward. 9's, stay close to me. A little grumpy, isn't she? She heard Sans comment to Nines before he and 2B fell out of earshot. Well, if you run into him, Sans called out, be nice to him. He's delicate. The woods seemed to go on forever, quiet and empty. The silence was unnerving in 2B's experience. Silences served as preludes to ambushes. A branch snapped, the crack nearly deafening. 2B nearly drew her sword and whirled around, only to see Nines standing beside a tree and sniffing the sap oozing from a branch he'd plucked from it. He looked at 2B as if he'd been caught red-handed stealing something. Research, he said, letting the branch fall to the ground. 2B sighed. You know, Nines said, catching up to her, how Sixo always asks you to take pictures of flowers and stuff for her. Imagine what she'd say if she were down here with us. Perish the thought. Oh, come on. You like her, don't you? 60 was the operator-type android assigned to observe and guide 2B from Yorha's base in orbit around the Earth. Her requests were sometimes bothersome, but a welcome sort of bothersome. 2B didn't quite know how to explain it. But she had to admit that 60's presence, her cheerful and sunny attitude, was sorely missed down here. I don't dislike her, 2B answered. 9S, what do you think? She asked him. About 60? I think you're lucky to have an operator with that kind of personality. I mean, 210 is good at what she does, and I like her, but sometimes she's just so. Not that. This place. These creatures. Well, they don't seem too bad, or at least that short guy didn't, but they don't have much love for humans down here, that's for sure, said Nines. We might be cut off from the bunker, but we still know Yorha's mission statement. If we could receive orders from command right now, I'm sure they'd recommend we neutralize them, just like the machines. The motto of Yorha was, "Glory to mankind." Nines was still young, still inexperienced, and still gung-ho enough to buy into it. 2B, though always the consummate professional, knew too much to accept that kind of tribalistic nonsense anymore, although she would never admit it to her peers, let alone her superiors. There was no room for ideological debate within Yorha, and 2B had seen firsthand what happened to models who'd gone against its hegemony. She'd had to kill some of them herself. Yes, 2B said, her voice flat and perfectly devoid of any emotion or judgment. That is exactly what they would recommend. For now, though, I think we should just concern ourselves with what happened to the other androids first, then move on to finding a way out of here. Yeah, I guess you're right. We can figure out what to do about this place when we get back in touch with the commander. As the two androids neared a clearing in the woods, a shrill, nasally voice cut through the air like a knife. Sans. It's been 8 days and you still haven't recalibrated your puzzles. All you do is sit and boondoggle. Standing in the clearing beside the short skeleton in the blue jacket was a much taller, lankier skeleton. A red scarf hung around the taller skeleton's neck, flapping in the air like a cape as he stood with gloved hands on his hips striking a handsome pose. How did Sans get ahead of us? 2B wondered. We've been traveling in a straight line. I will be the one, he shouted. I must be the one. I will capture a human. And then I, the great Papyrus, will get everything I utterly deserve. Papyrus flung out his arms. Respect. Recognition. I will finally be able to join the Royal Guard. People will ask to be my friend. 2B and Nines hid behind 2 trees on opposite sides of the path, neither saying a word. Papyrus went on. I will bathe in a shower of kisses every morning. The king will carve a hedge in the shape of my face. None of these good things will happen to be if we don't both work hard, so for goodness sake, Sans, start pulling your weight. I am, Sans protested with a non-committal shrug. I've gotten a ton of stuff done. A skeleton. Nines snorted with laughter, hastily disguised it as a cough to avoid giving away his presence, and then, realizing his mistake, tried in vain to disguise the cough as a bird call. Ah, come on, Papyrus. Who knows? There just might be a couple humans closer than you think. As if Sans knew the 2 androids were there, he looked down the path they'd taken and gave them a thumbs up. Papyrus crossed his arms, pouting. If you need me, I'll be working on my fiendishly challenging puzzles. As for you, he strode off, tossing the end of his scarf over his shoulder. Put some more backbone into your work. The path ahead forked. Papyrus took the left-hand path, and as he did so and vanished from sight, Sans sighed. Come on, guys. That was your cue. 2B stepped out of hiding. As I said, Mr. Sans, was it, we have business to attend to. You'll forgive us if we don't indulge your brother's crippling insecurity. This way, 9S. Papyrus barged back into the clearing. And one more thing, Sans. The skeleton stopped dead in his tracks, his eye sockets widening. Oh, my God. Are those? He crouched down to whisper to his brother. Are those humans? What, those? No, those are trees. Papyrus seemed to deflate. Ah. But what about those things in front of the trees? Papyrus perked up. Are those, he gasped. Actually, 2B said, growing tired of these charades, we're humans. Papyrus drew up to his full height and cleared his throat. You stand before the great Papyrus, the puzzle master of Snowdon. I, the soon-to-be youngest member of the Royal Guard, stand before you. I will challenge you. I will befuddle your human minds with puzzles of a genius-level caliber. I will capture you. I will take you to our great king and, he leaned over. Sans, he whispered, what happens next? Sans shrugged. We'll find that out later. Papyrus clapped his thick red gloves together. Follow me if you dare, humans, and the challenge will begin. He began walking down the left-hand path again. This way. Do not take the path to my right. If you do, you might run into the Royal Guard, and then I won't get any of the credit for capturing you. Did he say puzzles? Nines asked, an eager grin beginning to form on his face. He cracked his knuckles. I could give this guy a run for his money. Focus, 9S. 2B tapped on her support pod. Pod. Which path will take us closer to the black box signals? Analysis, based on long-range topological scans, the right-hand path is shorter. That settles it, then. 2B started down the pathway to the right. Down we go. The forest thinned out and gave way to snow-blanketed plateaus separated by deep ravines and valleys. Wooden bridges crisscrossed the open air. The cloud coverage grew thinner, revealing the dark and craggy walls and ceilings of the cavern. In one of the valleys, nestled at the side of a river and surrounded by a crescent of snow-capped trees, was a smattering of buildings ensconced in the soft amber glow of civilization. 2B stood at the edge of a steep escarpment and sniffed the crisp air. This was a beautiful place, but cold. It was fortunate she and Nines had such high tolerance for extreme temperatures, especially poor Nines, whose coat had begun to freeze solid and now crunched whenever he moved. It's gorgeous, Nines breathed. Why do these monsters want to leave so badly? I'd give my left stick of RAM to live here. Analysis, the extreme temperature range may make it quite difficult for most biological entities to survive this climate, Pod 153 offered. You'd need a thick skin to live here, said 2B as she led Nines across the bridge stretching across the ravine to the next plateau. Or no skin at all? Looking down through the uneven slats of the simple wooden bridge, 2B noticed large blocks of ice floating down the river. They were bobbing up and down in the rapids, nudging against the thin and fragile skin of frost gilding the water, their shapes far too perfect cubes for them to be natural ice flows. Nines noticed it as well. 2B, look. He leaned over the rope handrail and pointed over to the far bank of the river many meters below the opposite side of the bridge. Her line of sight followed the arc of his finger and saw, there on the riverbank, a hulking hairy creature carrying a long pole. 2B squinted and zoomed in on the image. The creature looked like a wolf, its pelt a mottled silvery gray, but it stood on two legs. With the pole like a shepherd's crook in its paws, it nudged the ice cubes as they sailed along. Further upriver, another hairy monster hefted a cloudy block of ice larger than it was and tossed it into the river. I read somewhere that before humans had invented refrigeration technology, transporting ice was a major industry, Nines commented. Enormous blocks of ice had to be hauled from cooler climes to warmer 2B, are you thinking what I'm thinking? 2B was. The river would naturally lead to an area that required so much ice in such large quantities. A warmer, more densely populated part of the kingdom. It's not like we can go in a straight line to wherever those signals terminate, but this river has to be the shortest path. Otherwise, too much of the ice would melt before it reached its destination. Are you suggesting we jump down there and follow the riverbank? 2B looked down. It was a long way down to the river, but nothing either of the two of them couldn't survive. You there? Humans. A trio of furry canine creatures in archaic plate armor rushed to the end of the bridge and began to cross it, shaking the rickety wooden slats and causing the bridge to sway. In the name of King Ascari, one shouted out, surrender to the Royal Guard immediately. Nines grabbed onto Pod 153, and with a roguish grin he replied, I'm thinking of something a little more dramatic. 2B nodded, taking hold of her own support pod's arm. Pod 042, Target our end of the bridge and fire. The pod nodded and fired a hail of bullets at the bridge, chewing it more voraciously than the hungriest termite. The bridge lurched and the world began to spin as what had once been solid footing became free fall. With nothing to slow their descent, the guard dogs plummeted to the water and splashed down in the midst of the ice floes. Nines and 2B, though, under their pod's power drifted safely down but drifted off course as well, missing the solid ground of the riverbank and ending up in the middle of the river. 2B touched down atop one of the massive ice floes, threw out her hand, and caught Nines by the arm before he could hit the water. She skidded and slipped across the ice as the river's strong current, a monster of its own with an appetite as insatiable as beasts of legend, took hold of 9SS legs and tried to drag him under. The guard dogs poked their heads above the water, one of them latching onto the same ice cube 2B had landed on with his claws and hauling himself up onto the frigid platform. The water coating this guard dog, already freezing, had slicked down his thick pelt of black and white fur to make him seem far skinnier than he had before. Under the added weight, the cube bucked and swayed. The other two took their positions on adjacent floes, baring their teeth and their weapons. 2B's stiletto heels dug into the ice like pitons, anchoring her in place as she pulled with all her might, the tug-of-war between android and nature threatening to wrench her shoulder from its socket. As the river dragged her and Nines along, 2B's heels rent furrows in the ice, her feet edging closer and closer to the edge of the cube. Pod, take my shoulders and pull. 2B let go of the pod and grabbed onto 9SS arm with both hands. She nearly flew off the cube right then and there, only for Pod 042 to latch onto her and lend her its own strength. Nines came free of the churning froth, the force 2B had been exerting tossing him over her head as her feet slipped out from under her. 2B fell onto the surface of the ice floe and slid on her back, her legs falling off the surface and dangling in thin air. Before she could slide all the way into the river, she twisted herself onto her stomach and grabbed her sword in a reverse icepick grip to drive it into the ice and anchor herself. The blade put a long crack into the cube but held fast, and 2B managed to haul her legs back on solid ice. Nines drew his own sword and raised it just in time to parry a strike from the dog who'd climbed onto the ice floe, sparks flying from the guard's sword as the blade's mechanized teeth ground against the brass-bronze blade of the cruel oath in 9SS hand. 2B recognized the sword as a part of the now obsolete Yorha Type 3 equipment set, a weapon salvaged from one of the fallen humans. The guard dog fell back, swaying as he tried to keep his footing on the ice as Nines took the opportunity to reach out and take 2B's hand. As 2B rose to her feet, a spray of white bullets, the same as the friendliness pellets Floey had been able to conjure back in the ruins, tore through the surface of the ice, throwing up a hail of chips into the air. The ice chips sprayed against 2B's face, a shower of cold but ultimately fragile and harmless needles. One of the guard dogs standing on an adjacent ice floe, this one wielding a huge, if primitive, double-headed battle axe. He shook his head, spraying droplets of cold water through the air. Some of the water, already frozen into ice, clung in beads to his white fur, while the other droplets froze in midair and clattered across both ice floes. Raising a gauntleted paw, the dog let loose another burst of magically conjured bullets and tore into 2B and 9SS ice floe, forming a worryingly growing crack along one of its fault lines. Pod 042 retaliated with a hail of gunfire. The axe-wielding dog raised his weapon to block the spray of bullets, so Pod 042 changed its target to the ice floe beneath him, ripping through it and gouging out huge chunks of its surface. Nines parried another strike from the dog with the purloined Yorha issue sword as the ice floe shuddered and bucked yet again, its corner dipping under the churning, frothy surface of the river. The other two ice floes, driven by helpful pushes from the shepherds on either side of the river, slammed into the android's ice floes. The cube in the middle began to shear under the stress. The impact sent Nines tumbling down and nearly knocked 2B off her feet as well, just as the axe-wielding guard dog brought his battle axe down on the cube. The heavy, oversized blade of the axe stuck in the ice cube. Nines swung his sword from his prone position and caught the dog with the Type 3 sword across the thigh, sending him down as well. The mechanized sword fell from the dog's paws as one more strike from 9SS sword cut through his chest. The dog collapsed and turned to fine white dust as the two flanking ice cubes banged against the middle one yet again. The opposite ice cube from 2B had yet another axe-wielding guard dog with just as large and thick of a battle axe in her paws. She deftly used it to block the gunfire from Pod 153. The middle ice cube kept crumbling and finally split apart, separating 2B and Nines. The half 2B stood on pitched and yacht in the water and rolled over, as the once relatively flat surface of the floe became its side and threatened to capsize its passengers. 2B leaped for the axe-wielding dog's cube. 2B grabbed onto the edge of the cube, her fingers digging into it with all her might as she swung her legs over the side and slid behind the guard dog. Nines tried to pull himself up as his half of the ice cube tumbled in the river, but the water that had doused his legs when he'd nearly been swept away by the current had now frozen and fused to the ice cube's surface. Pod 153 swooped down and applied a small cutting torch to the ice in a valiant effort to free him. 2B raised her sword as the axe-wielding dog whirled around to face her. Axe met sword, the ancient weapon proving remarkably resilient against the pristine blade of 2B's virtuous contract. Glancing over the guard dog's shoulder, 2B saw 9S's severed ice floe bobbing in the swirling currents as he struggled to free himself. A hard metal pole dug into 2B's back, knocking her forward. She stumbled as the dog's axe swung down and bit into her right forearm. Switching her sword from right to left hand just in time to parry another swing, 2B glanced behind her shoulder just in time to see one of the wolfish ice shepherds swinging his pole for her head. 2B ducked as the blunt pole swished across the air. Pod 042 fired on the wolf and hit him square in the chest. The monster immediately disintegrated, his pole tumbling into the river. 2B slid further back against the impact of yet another axe strike, nearly to the opposite end of the ice cube, and reached out, snatching the long ice shepherd's pole as its tip caught the water. She swung the pole over her head, it traveled in a long and lazy arc through the air with a satisfying swoosh. The axe-wielding guard dog threw up his axe to block the pole, giving 2B the perfect opportunity to lash out with her blade and bisect the dog through the torso. "Dogaressa, my love," he cried out with a mournful howl as his body collapsed into dust. 2B took a split second to catch her breath before hefting the shepherd's pole again. The other ice cube carrying the final remaining guard dog clashed with 9S's chipped, cracked, and dwindling floe. 2B took a running leap and thrust the pole forward, burying it into the surface of the dog's ice cube and pole vaulting her way onto it. As she sailed through the air, Pod 042 swooped down from her side and took hold of Nines along with Pod 153. The two support pods lifted him up from the crumbling ice floe just before it broke apart. 2B landed on the ice floe behind the final guard dog, tossing the pole aside. The guard dog's battle axe crashed down with a force and ferocity easily double that of her counterparts, and if not for a quickly timed evasive maneuver, it would have surely split 2B's skull open. The dog snarled as she wrenched her axe free of the ice. "Dogami! I vow to avenge!" Nines dropped out of the sky, the two support pods hovering above him, and with a quick slash, he caught the guard dog in the throat with his blade. The dog staggered back, blood pouring in dark burgundy gouts from the wound before she fell off the edge of the ice floe. Her body turned to dust before it hit the water. Nines skidded to a halt, throwing his arm around 2B for support. The two of them collapsed onto the surface of the ice floe as it drifted down the river. On both sides, the ice shepherds were starting to desert their posts, throwing down their poles and fleeing in terror. "Well," said Nines, panting, "that didn't go as planned." "You all right, 2B?" 2B nodded. "And yourself?" "Legs are still a bit stiff," a smile tugged at the corners of 9S's mouth. "But it's not like we can get frostbite, eh?" The ice floe carrying the two androids drifted down the river, into the mouth of a cave, and sailed deeper down a twisting, dark subterranean river. The cave walls were hewn of dark, purplish rock, the banks of the river muddy silt, choked with tall river grasses. The air was warmer and more humid, the sound of dripping and trickling water omnipresent. Luminescent violet-pink crystals hung from the tunnel's water-worn walls, and overhead, diamond dust studded in the ceiling twinkled like stars. As Nines and 2B sailed deeper into the kingdom of monsters, a figure clad in armor watched from afar, gritting her fangs and clenching her fists in anger. Chapter 3, A Birth of a Wish. The ice floe started to sweat as the warmer, humid air of the watery cave network began to eat away at it. The river's current was slowing and weakening, and as the combined search beacons of the androids' support pods flashed across the walls and ceiling of the tunnel, it became obvious as to why. Up ahead, the ceiling had caved in, completely damming the river. The ice cube bumped up against the ceiling-high pile of rubble and drifted drunkenly in place, carried along lost and wandering eddies denied their natural route. Other cubes began to drift into the dead end, caught in the same meandering and diverted swirls of current. 2B suppressed a disappointed scowl. So much for that plan. Nines reached out and brushed his fingers against the dam, angling Pod 153's beacon to cast its light upward where the pile of large, heavy rocks kissed the ceiling. Pod 153, update geographical scans. He paused for a moment. These rocks are hot. This cave-in happened recently, and not naturally. And it goes on for nearly 50 meters. It seemed to 2B someone had sent a message ahead of them to block their path. Sensible, but at the same time ill-advised. This river did seem to be an important industrial conduit. Blocking it could do more harm than good to the kingdom. At any rate, the two of them would have to take the long way around. 2B trudged through reed-choked water that nearly came up to her knees alongside Nines, their makeshift ice flow raft abandoned. This new region of the underground kingdom was almost like a new planet in its eerie beauty. The star-like diamonds scattered across the tunnel's ceiling were almost inspirational to behold. As the tunnel widened, 2B and Nines stepped up onto dry land or, at the very least, damp land. The soil was pale, almost purplish in the light of the luminescent crystals dotting the rock walls, and fungi sprouting out of the dirt glowed a pale aquamarine. Nines schemed his hand through the damp sand and picked up a twisted, misshapen lump of grayish-black rock stained with mud, then gasped and dropped it, wincing. Something the matter? Nines shook his head. No, it's just hot. Really hot. He rolled it in the sand a bit with the tip of his boot before picking it up again. He brushed the mud away, revealing that the little formation was speckled and translucent. Fulgurite. Looks like lightning struck here. And recently. Judging by the heat. 2B looked up at the ceiling less than a meter above her head. And where would this lightning come from? Nines shrugged. Beats me. At some points the tunnels became straighter, their walls and floors smoother. It seemed as though the monster living here had once tried to build this entire network of caves, caverns, and subterranean rivers into something more civilized, but they seemed to have given up rather quickly and, judging by the weathering on the bricks in these barely tamed stretches of the hallway, quite a long time ago as well. It all reminded 2B of an anthill. Nines brushed his hand against the wall. Hey, 2B. Hold on. There's writing here. That's hardly our concern, 2B replied. Keep up, 9S. The War of Humans and Monsters, he read aloud. 2B, his voice echoed through the hallway. Don't you think this might be important to know about? 2B paused, crossing her arms. Nines had a point. Go on. Why did the humans attack? Indeed, it seemed they had nothing to fear. Humans are unbelievably strong. It would take the soul of nearly every monster just to equal the power of a single human soul. But humans have one weakness. It is, ironically, the strength of their soul. Its power allows it to persist outside the human body even after death. If a monster defeats a human, they can take its soul. A monster with a human soul, a horrible beast with unfathomable power. Well, 2B said as Nines paused, struggling to make out the next few glyphs, that probably won't happen anytime soon unless we win the machine war very quickly. This power has no counter. Indeed, a human cannot take a monster's soul. When a monster dies, its soul disappears and an incredible power would be needed to take the soul of a living monster. There is only one exception. The soul of a special species of monster. These souls are strong enough to persist after death, if only for a few moments. A human could absorb this soul, but this has never happened. And now it never will. These guys sure are pessimistic, Nines concluded. They're right, 2B said. All those thousands of years and not a single human fell down here, even when the human race still lived on this planet. And in the thousands of years since then, only half a dozen of us have ever come here. If human souls are their salvation, they will be waiting for a very long time. When the war ended, leaving thousands of monsters dead and only a handful of human casualties, the humans gathered 7 sages to imprison us deep within a magical barrier. The barrier, the bars of our horrible prison, was made through the strength of 7 human souls, and only through the strength of 7 human souls can it be unmade. Nines traced the final line of glyphs engraved on the wall. Hey! This writing is newer than the rest. A single monster can pass through, but not break, the barrier with only a single human soul. This has only happened once. And it did not end well for the monster. The only way to free our race is to gather 7 human souls and present them to our king. Glory to Askari. He will become as a god. They think we're humans, said Nines, holding a hand to his chin as he pondered the writing. So the 6 black box signals, those must be coming from androids they're saving for some kind of holy ritual. And if we aren't careful, said 2B, leading him further down the hall, either of us could be the 7th. I can't help but feel bad for these guys, though 2B, do you really think they were persecuted by humans? The focus on souls sounds more religious than historical, 2B commented. And either way, it could just as easily be propaganda. Cave scrawls are hardly rigorously derived treatises on history. Nines shrugged. Persecuted or not, the punishment feels a little excessive. Beautiful place, but I don't know if I'd want to live here. The hall opened up into a larger chamber. The ceiling was high above and obscured by clouds of condensation. Wooden platforms wound their way across the walls up to its misty heights. Flowers glowing a pale cyan covered the ground, swaying gently even though there was no breeze to move them. The circular shape of this space called to mind an arena, although the flowers suggested a garden. 2B walked on, the glow from the meadow casting a blue-green light against the pale skin of her thighs. As her legs brushed against the flowers, a cacophony of whispers reached her ears. I wish my job was easier. I wish that girl I like would ask me out. I wish my mom would start feeling better. I wish I could see the moon. 2B paused. As the flowers surrounding her settled down, so too did the whispering voices. 9S, she hissed, glancing back at him. Did you? Still standing on the edge of the field, Nines gingerly nudged a single flower with his foot. I wish I didn't have to live in Snowdon. He knelt down. The soft bioluminescent glow cast a ghoulish pallor across his face even as it tinted his white hair a brilliant aquamarine. It's the flowers. With another prod the flower spoke again, this time whispering in a meek and tinny reproduction of 9S's voice the exact phrase he had said. Nines looked up at 2B with an eager grin. It's the flowers, 2B. They record everything we say. 2B took another step and another susurrus of timidly hissed hopes and dreams filled the air, covering up the sound of rustling leaves and dripping water. I hope Askari will free us. Come on, Nines. We can't afford to waste time. Nines shot up to his feet and caught up with 2B, the flowers in his wake spilling the secrets of the monsters who'd spoken to them. The 2 androids strode through the gloomy meadow, 1,000 wishes following after them. I wish Askari could find 7 human souls. I hope we can all see the surface someday. I wish I could find a human. I hope Askari can become a god. Glory to Askari. Become a god. 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 2B's reflexes fired and not 1 second too soon she slipped backward as a bolt of lightning struck the ground where she'd just been standing. Steam rose from the charred remains of one of the strange echoing flowers. The cacophony, the endless aspirations of these monsters, filled the air, but the thunderclap had left them more muted than usual. The ringing remained in 2B's ears for several seconds while her auditory systems adjusted themselves in response to the stimuli. 6 human souls. The voice came from above, booming and ringing in the air and overpowering the whispered echoes. As 2B craned her neck and locked onto the source of the outburst, she saw an armored figure wreathed in shadows standing atop one of the wooden platforms ringing the chamber. The knight pounded a glowing aquamarine spear against the wooden slats, causing the whole platform to shake. Our king, on whose shoulders rest our hopes and dreams, possesses 6 of the human souls he needs to free our people. The knight took a few heavy, thudding steps down to the next platform, twirling the spear shaft in its hand all the whole. 1 more soul and our great king Askari will set us free. 2B eyed the cave opening at the other end of the massive chamber as the knight drew closer to the ground with theatrical slowness. 9S, this way. She beckoned over to the cave. We've been in this mountain for tens of thousands of years, suffering under the yoke of... The knight paused as 2B and Nines made for the passage on the other side of the meadow. Hey! The knight leaped up and threw the spear in midair. The spear buried itself in the ground at 2B's feet, nearly tearing the hem of her dress. Nines nearly ran into her as she came to a sudden stop. The knight made a perfect three-point landing in the middle of the field of echo flowers, stood up, and with a dramatic flourish tore the helmet off its head. "Don't you run away while I'm telling our story, you murderous chumbuckets." Beneath the sharp, spiny knight's helmet was a fishy blue scaled face, a long shock of crimson hair, and a single angry yellow eye. The other was obscured by a ragged black eye patch. "Damn it! I am Undyne, captain of the Royal Guard. We've got 6 human souls and you've got about 5 seconds." Undyne lunged at the androids. 2B took the lead and threw herself in front of her partner, since Nines, although capable of defending himself, lacked the combat-focused programming she had. Spear met sword, and 2B felt her heels drag through the mud beneath her feet as Undyne pushed her back. An electric tingle numbed her hands as she parried blow after blow. She leaped back, a spray of bullets from her support pod covering her retreat. She didn't have time to waste here. Her HUD showed that the 6 black box signals were still miles away. Nines grabbed her by the arm. "Pod, collapse the tunnel on my mark." With a dutiful nod, the black-hulled support pod drifted into position at the end of the tunnel as the 2 androids drew closer. "Oh, no you don't." Undyne snarled, baring gnarled, yellowed fangs. She banged the butt of her spear on the ground, and on cue a forest of glowing spears burst from the ground at the mouth of the tunnel, blocking it like bars of a prison cell. "You're not running away." The joints in 2B's legs seized, locking her knees and ankles. The android found herself immobilized from the waist down. An eldritch emerald glow like the coronal discharge seen on ships at sea St. Elmo's fire, 2B believed it had once been called, enveloped her body. "What?" she hissed. Had this enemy hacked into her systems somehow? "Gotcha!" Undyne cried out. With a triumphant clench of her fist, a squadron of glowing spears appeared in the air at her side and launched themselves at 2B. Nines grabbed 2B by the waist and tried to pull her free, but 2B's feet had somehow become rooted to the ground, and as he tugged on her the fire enveloped his legs as well, pinning him to the ground along with 2B. With the volley fast approaching, 2B readied her blade. As her sword met the flying spears they vanished into flurries of sparks. 2B tightened her grip on the sword's hilt as another hail of spears came her way, but as she swung to bat them out of the air they changed course, breaking formation, and flying at the 2 androids from all angles. Nines gritted his teeth. "Pod, engage P-shield." The pod nodded, and a shimmering sphere of energy appeared around 2B and Nines just in time to block every single one of the flying spears. 2B growled as the shield flickered and faded away. One last spear made it through, but she managed to twist enough to swat it out of the air before it could hit Nines. She tried in vain to pull herself free of the morass entangling her legs. Undyne yawned. "All right. That's enough for now." 2B lost her balance as the emerald aura vanished, but fortunately it took only a fraction of a second for her to adjust. That second was all Undyne would give her. With a feral snarl, the captain closed in. 2B ran for the blocked tunnel entrance. She had no intention of wasting time here. She tore one of the glowing lightning spears from the ground in order to make a gap wide enough to slip through. The strange, semi-substantial lance sent a numbing jolt of electricity up her arms. She and Nines made it into the tunnel, their boots slipping against the slick, muddy floor. Nines glanced back at the tunnel entrance. "Pod. Laser. Now." The black support pod loosed a blast of energy at the tunnel ceiling, caving in the entrance in a shower of rocks. "Kman, 2B. Let's." Undyne slid under the collapsing tunnel entrance, quickly catching up with the androids. With a mighty roundhouse kick she slammed her armored boot against 9S's head, knocking him off his feet. Continuing onward on her own momentum, Undyne conjured another spear and swung it at 2B. With the purloined spear and her sword 2B locked Undyne's spear in place, struggling to wrench it out of her hands. The synthetic musculature underneath 2B's skin burned. The monster's strength took her by surprise. The idea that something not made of metal could hold its own in hand-to-hand combat with an android built exclusively for combat was almost laughably ridiculous. Undyne gritted her teeth as her strength met 2B's. "Do you have any idea how selfish you're being?" she growled. Her breath smelled, unsurprisingly, like fish. 2B didn't waste energy responding. Just one, little, soul. That's all we need. Undyne shoved 2B against the slick, mossy tunnel wall. Do you have any idea how long we've been stuck down here? This cannot continue. There's nothing for you up there. 2B pushed Undyne back and thrust her against the opposite wall. Those are not human souls you've been taking. Undyne reared back and cracked her forehead against 2B's. Much to 2B's surprise, more than just her HUD flickered under the impact, all of her visual processors momentarily ceased, plunging her into darkness for a second that felt like an eternity. As 2B's visual processors came back online, Undyne grabbed her by the arm with both hands, twisted, then tried to break the android's forearm over her knee. It didn't work. Android limbs were made of stronger stuff than the captain was likely accustomed to, but it did still hurt. But the captain still kept a tight grip on 2B's arm, and with a mighty roar threw her over her shoulder. 2B saw luminescent crystals protruding from the rock walls and ceiling spin around her as she hit the ground. Cold, brackish water drenched her dress. 2B kicked at Undyne as she hit the ground, her stiletto heel catching on the captain's eye patch and pulling it off. Undeterred, Undyne leaped into the air and landed on top of 2B, driving her elbow into the android's stomach and knocking the wind out of her. Before Undyne could do any more damage, Nines rushed to 2B's aid, impaled the captain's shoulder on the brassy blade of the cruel oath, and pushed her away. He reached out to 2B. You all right down there? 2B sprang up, holding onto Pod 042's manipulator arm for support as it floated at her side and taking 9's hand. Took you long enough. Sorry. I have to admit, I've never been kicked so hard I went blind. He and 2B kept running. The corridor twisted and turned, but soon 2B could see a soft orange light glowing at the end. The Soliton radar on her HUD suggested the tunnel opened into a much larger area, which the android was thankful for. It would be much easier to escape this monster in a wide-open environment. Nines pulled a few paces ahead of 2B as the two of them drew closer to the exit. Surprised, he looked back. You all right, 2B? 2B clutched at the stitch in her side but didn't let the jabbing pain stop her. It's nothing. We'll have time for maintenance later. She and Nines emerged from the tunnel and found themselves standing in a vast, hot cave. The ground was cracked and steaming. At the bottom of deep crevasses cutting the landscape into pillars of stone were languid rivers of magma. The air, hot and dry, shimmered. 2B sized up the area. Could any organic life form last here for long? If Undyne was still in pursuit, 2B and Nines could turn this into a war of attrition and simply run from her until she expired from the intense heat. As 2B pondered tactics, a spear caught her in the calf. The only reason 2B failed to slip and fall from the impact was because her legs had once again frozen. She glanced over her shoulder. Undyne was catching up, readying another salvo of spears. Pod. 2B shouted out. Shield. At the same moment, Nines threw himself in front of her. His black support pod drifted to his side, its hull folding open. Pod, laser. Pod 153 fired its laser as ordered, the burst of directed plasma burning right through Undyne's heart. At that instant, the magic ensnaring 2B's legs released itself. Pod 042 engaged its projectile shield. What happened next felt, paradoxically, like both an instant and an eternity at the same time. The flying spear Undyne had tossed with her last bit of strength passed under the shield before it could fully envelop the two of them. Undeterred, it hit Nines with dead-eye accuracy, its pointed arrowhead tip burying itself in his eye. He stumbled backward, his arms which had once moved so purposefully flopping limply at his sides as the spear exited the back of his head with a spray of synthetic blood. The spear stuck there, half of its length protruding from both sides of the android's skull. Bolts of electricity arced between the glowing spear shaft and the brass buttons on 9's dirted black coat before the glowing lance of lightning faded away. 2B felt her breath freeze. 9's. He turned his head as if he could still hear her voice. But 2B could already tell from just the slack expression on his face that he was gone, even as the torn-apart visor circling his head fell away to reveal a single remaining eye that stared blankly ahead. The light had already gone out. Nines was dead before his body hit the ground. Before 2B could run to him, A figure stepped forth from the cloud of dust pouring from the tunnel's mouth. Despite the hole in her heart, Undyne looked as alive as ever. A flickering aura of blue-green electrical arcs surrounded her, and her single good eye had turned jet black with a single pinprick of ice-searing white light in its center. The weakness in 2B's knees vanished as rage flooded her body. She grabbed the two support pods. Pod 042. Pod 153. Blade. Both pods projected a long, sharp energy blade, filling the air with the sharp smell of burnt ozone, and with both weapons 2B leaped into battle. The resurrected Undyne parried 2B's wrathful blows with growing desperation but grinned in spite of the exertion. "Hurts, doesn't it?" she cackled. She narrowly dodged 2B's next attack, the nanometer-sharp edge of the projected energy blade severing her ear fin and a lock of her scarlet hair, and buried her spear in 2B's right bicep. "Doesn't it? Oh, boo-hoo, he was my friend. How do you think I feel?" Synthetic blood trickled down from the wound, staining the white cuff of 2B's sleeve red. Bursts of snowy static washed over 2B's visual processor as the electricity from the spear spilled through her motor systems and caused her injured arm to spasm uncontrollably. She let go of Pod 153 as her fingers jerked wildly. "I have friends, too. I've lost friends. The Snowden K9 unit. My troops and friends, destroyed, because of the whims of a single human? How do you think it feels?" 2B stumbled backward as Pod 153 and Pod 042 laid down more suppressing fire to cover her retreat. She tore the spear out of her arm, throwing it aside, then rummaged through her inventory for some staunching gel and hastily applied it to the wound. The flow of blood bubbled, congealed, and slowed as some degree of feeling and control returned to her injured arm. Her near-field combat software kicked in, conjuring the virtuous contract back to her right hand as she ran across a rickety wood bridge spanning the length of one of the magma chamber's ravines. Undyne fought her way past the combined pods suppressing fire, casting off what remained of her heavy armor as sweat poured off her scales. With heightened swiftness she swung her spear with wild and reckless abandon, tearing through Pod 153's black hull in the process. The pod sparked and exploded, waving its arms helplessly in the brief moment it had before its core reactor went critical. "Your time's up, villain. You won't hurt anyone else," Undyne growled, her spear sparking and flickering as she raised it and leveled it at 2B. "A knight in shining armor has appeared. And all the pain you have inflicted on the fallen, every hope, every dream you've turned to dust. I'll make you feel that pain 100 times over through the power of this spear." Further incensed, 2B readied her blade, spun on her heel, and lunged at the monster. Undyne ran across the bridge and the two struck at the same time, rather than clashing, both spear and sword passed by each other. The tip of Undyne's spear left a gash across 2B's cheek under her right eye and across the bridge of her nose and kept going, piercing her left eye. What remained of 2B's black cloth visor fluttered to bottom of the ravine, taking her HUD with it. As the visor dwindled to a speck it shimmered under the heat haze before bursting into flames above the magma river far below. 2B's feet found purchase on solid rock once more. Blood poured down her cheeks like tears as she skidded to a halt and whirled around, immediately assuming a combat stance to fend off Undyne's next attack. Undyne kept going under her own momentum in the opposite direction and staggered to a stop on the opposite side of the swaying bridge. She turned around, her blue-scaled skin split open across her torso to reveal exposed flesh as scarlet as her long and flowing hair. 2B's sword had left a diagonal gash running from her shoulder to her opposite hip, the blade nearly biting deeply enough to cut the monster in two. Dust fluttered down from the wound. Undyne's body was crumbling away just like the other monsters. But more than that, her extremities were beginning to whiten and liquefy, dripping off her body like water from a melting ice sculpture, melding with the sweat pouring down her skin. Undyne smiled and began to laugh as she looked down at her own eroding body, then at 2B. "You're pretty good," she called out from across the bridge. 2B's gloves creaked as she tightened her grip on her sword's hilt. She could hear her own breath hiss its way between her gritted teeth. Undyne took a step forward onto the creaking bridge, her melting legs wobbling as more of her body crumbled into white powder and floated on the thick, humid air. "I'm sorry, everyone," Undyne murmured. Sometimes the heroes don't win after all, huh." She looked 2B square in the eye as a single tear fell from her single blackened eye. It really sickens me, you know? To see you so mad about your friend. Like you deserve to be mad. The captain took another step forward, and another, each one steadier than the last. And with each step Undyne took 2B felt her hatred towards her grow. You don't know how to do anything but kill, don't you? If I let you pass here, you'll kill people, more friends, and you won't stop once you leave here, will you? Arcs of electricity crackled across Undyne's body as she reached out for 2B, her hand trembling. Alphys, are you watching? I hope. I've given you enough time. A mess of dust and watery slime, Undyne stumbled and slipped through the gaps between the bridge's wooden slats and fell into the magma far below. 2B let out the air that had been growing stale in her chest and fell to her knees at 9S's side, burying her sword in the ground. A cursory glance at the condition of his body told her what she already knew. The spear had blown a hole the size of a fist all the way through his head, leaving behind a ragged tunnel of metal and synthetic gore. An elite Yoarha unit was not supposed to be so affected by the death of a comrade. So why had 2B felt such an ache in her core as she'd watched 9S's body crumple to the ground? Why did it feel like a vice had started squeezing her chest as she looked over his corpse? Nines, it wasn't supposed to go this way, she whispered in a cracked, small voice. I was supposed to. Her words fought their way past a lump in her throat as tears fell from her eye and left shining splotches on her counterpart's cheek. 2B knew there was something wrong with her. It always hurt more than it should. She'd tried so hard not to let it happen this time. She'd always tried so hard to push him away since the first time he'd died, but no matter how icily she'd tried to behave in front of him, she couldn't erase how she felt. Emotions are prohibited, she told herself. Emotions are prohibited. Emotions are prohibited. Emotions are prohibited. Emotions are prohibited. Emotions are. Pod 042 floated by her side. Statement: severe electrical damage detected throughout Unit 9S's body. Chances of successful resuscitation are 0.001. 2B reached out, plucked Pod 042 out of the air, and held it close despite its protestations, letting the gentle vibrations of its metal hull resonate comfortingly against her chest as she huddled by 9S's side. Nines. How many more times, she thought, will I have to watch you die? Chapter 4, A Fortress of Lies. 2B knelt over 9S's body and laid a hand on his face. His cheeks were still warm, his skin still soft and supple. The only indication that he wasn't merely sleeping or temporarily shut down was the hole tunneling its way through his head. Rigor mortis had yet to set in, and so 2B took what little opportunity she had left to close his grey-blue eye and his still agape mouth, wiping away the look of dull surprise his face had been locked into in his final moments. I was built to kill things. I was made to watch things die. And I've seen nines die more times than I care to count. Why does it hurt, then? 2B asked herself. And why does it hurt so much more this time? An android existed only as long as their memories existed. In the bunker hovering in orbit above the Earth, they'd upload 9S's backup from only a few days ago into a fresh body, and when 2B returned, the two of them would carry on. But the nines who'd come this far with 2B, the nines who'd leaped in front of her, the nines who'd thrown a snowball at her and nailed her right in the back of her head. She would never see him again. That was how it always was. 2B unbuttoned 9S's coat and the shirt beneath it, exposing the pale flesh of his bare chest, and with trembling fingers slid open the small, almost unnoticeable hatch just below his sternum and removed the black box unit from within. A perfect obsidian cube streaked with glittering white strata, small enough to fit in her palm, hung inert between her thumb and forefinger. She held it to her forehead. The black box wasn't humming. 2B placed the black box back into its proper resting place and closed up the cavity. Disregarding the horrific wound, Nines looked like he was sleeping. 2B hoisted 9S's lifeless body up over her shoulder. I won't let these monsters have you, she told him as she held his corpse aloft at the edge of the ravine and stared into the glowing, rippling magma far below. You won't become their seventh sacrifice. I won't allow you to be desecrated like that. She let 9S's body fall into the river. The corpse and its clothes burst into flames before it even hit the surface of the magma, then the charred and blackened figure, utterly unrecognizable, slowly dwindled away as the molten rock oozed over it and consumed it. Goodbye, Nines. 2B stared out at the massive industrial structure off in the distance obscured by rippling heat haze, then ripped the virtuous contract out of the ground and pushed herself forward. All those other times Nines had died, retribution had been out of her grasp. But not today. She was going to make them pay. 2B cut through the core like an avenging angel. The core. That was what they called it as they threw wave after wave of their soldiers in front of her. A twisting maze of corridors and metal scaffolding hanging over a pulsating sea of liquid light. Defend the core. Hold the core. Don't let her leave the core. They fell. They all fell. The industrial structure itself turned against her, a stuttering coward screaming at her over the intercom system all the while as cutting lasers zeroed in on her and robotic assembly arms did their best to catch her. Corridors folded in on themselves, rotated, slid from one segment of the core to another, an ever-shifting labyrinth trying desperately to contain her in a dead end. 2B could not be contained. All she knew how to do was kill. And kill she did. The ones who stood in her path, the ones who came at her screaming with swords and axes and flails and elaborate patterns of bullets, she cut down. The ones who ran and hid, she ignored. And as she went on, many more monsters began to run and hide. The core rebelled against 2B with increasingly frantic zeal. She barely made it out of a corridor that had begun to seal itself off in preparation to eject itself into the hot and energetic maelstrom below. As the bulkheads slid shut they pinched off 2B's right arm at the elbow, crushing her forearm to a paste of crushed and flattened synthetic bones, macerated synthetic skin and muscles, and gushing synthetic blood and coolant. Screaming with such agony she nearly passed out. 2B tore herself free, leaving ragged strands of what had once been strong ligaments hanging from a useless half of an elbow joint. It didn't matter. The monsters were easy to kill. One hand was enough. She nearly lost her leg next. A spike-studded mace reduced her left foot to a lump of scrap dangling from her ankle, scraping against the floor as she limped along. 2B was only vaguely aware of how heavy her breathing was, how much her chest was heaving, how salty the sweat pouring from her brow was, how hotly the straining muscles beneath her skin and hard-shelled chassis were burning. She was growing weaker by the second and she hardly noticed it. A swinging pipe slammed into the back of her head, shooting pulses of static and misaligned colors through her visual systems. Without her visor and thus without her HUD 2B couldn't see any of the myriad error messages that must have been running through her system at the moment she stumbled and fell to her knees, although Pod 042 did its best to rattle them off for her while firing at her assailants. As the core began to fall silent 2B picked herself up. "This is for you, Nines," she kept telling herself. "I could never have my revenge on your murderer before. So I'm having it here, on them." Straining, stumbling, staggering, 2B kept fighting until nobody else was willing to fight her. 2B limped out of the core and through the empty city that followed it, cradling the sheared-off stump of her left arm. Her numbing fingers clutched at the synthetic, fragmented bones jutting from her artificial flesh. A trail of dripping blood, coolant, and lubricant followed in her wake. The city's inhabitants kept their distance, most scarcely brave enough to peek out their windows as 2B passed by down the abandoned roads. As a result, the city was silent as a grave, as quiet and moribund as the ruins of ancient human societies that dotted the earth above ground. She could only hear the creaking and whirring of her own overtaxed servos mingled with the sound of her lame foot scraping against the ground and the sound of her own heavy breathing. She paused, leaning against a derelict automobile for support as she caught her breath. Pod 042 floated by her side, still a constant companion after everything 2B had gone through. Statement: Unit 2B has sustained severe damage to critical physical systems. At the current rate of deterioration, hibernation mode will automatically engage to prevent injuries incompatible with life in 43 minutes, 15 seconds, and counting. 2B gasped for air, a knife-like pain seizing her side, then stumbled back down the road. Comment: Noted, Pod. Moving on. Pod 042 let her know that the 6 black box signals were emanating from the center of the castle up ahead, the old and crumbling colossus, almost cathedral-like in its elegance, that jutted out from the sheer, craggy walls of the massive cavern housing the city. Nobody stopped 2B from venturing deeper inside the castle, its fortifications just as silent as the city. The settling of ancient foundations and subtle creaking sounds were buried beneath the comparatively deafening sounds of her own footsteps. Well, I'll be darned. 2B whirled around to face the source of the voice, her sword held out. There, in a corner of the dilapidated castle's foyer, was one golden flower mingled among many, the only one in a bouquet of potted plants to bear a face. Floey whistled. Howdy. I thought I'd lost you for a bit there, but... 2B cut the flowers down. Floey retreated too quickly, though, and of the petals that hung in the air and fluttered down to the floorboards, none were his. You didn't bring your friend with you. Floey's voice came from further down the hall. 2B followed it. Is he gone? I bet you killed him, too. 2B picked up speed, her sword tearing through the wall as she swung it in a deadly arc. Floey vanished yet again. Wouldn't be surprised, murderer. 2B grunted and gritted her teeth. Pod, target, and open fire on the source of that voice. Affirmative, Unit 2B. Pod 042 loosed a salvo of bullets at Floey, but the malevolent plant only ducked out of sight once again. The blasts pummeled the wall, leaving the peeling yellow wallpaper blackened and smoking and tearing the small table in the corner to shrapnel. Oh, don't get me wrong. I didn't mean that as a pejorative. I really do admire murderers, you know. 2B ascended the castle, firing on Floey whenever he reared his head. The black box signals were drawing nearer. You're afraid, aren't you? It's okay. I was, too. I was alone after we died, after I came back. Floey came too close that time and 2B's strike managed to take a petal before he vanished back into the walls. I saw Dad again. He was sitting there in his favorite garden like he always was. He cried when he heard me calling his name. He hugged me. Floey popped away before Pod 042 could get a bead on him and reappeared further down the hall. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad or happy, or anything. I tried, but I didn't feel anything, except maybe boredom. That was how it felt for you, too, wasn't it? When you came back to life. The ensuing salvo tore the hallway apart, but Floey, as always, danced just out of reach. Androids didn't feel either, 2B told herself. As much as it might seem they did feel, their emotions were simulacra and nothing more. Love made one feel affection for one's comrades. Hate made one strong against one's enemies. Killing produced a rush of elation, an artificial jolt of euphoria akin to what in the human brain would have been dopamine. All of that made one a more effective warrior to Yorha against the machine scourge. That was all it was. Fake emotions. Fake emotions for fake people. So why did it still hurt when she thought about Nines? Why did it always hurt? I tried to fill that void however I could. I tried to make friends with everyone I met. But I couldn't. I just didn't care whether they were happy or sad. I mean, why would I? 2B kept going. Now that the little pest was becoming more talkative, she had to admit there was something familiar about his voice. But where had she heard it before? Its inexplicable familiarity, like the voice of an old friend, irked her like a cluster of dead pixels on her HUD. So I started killing them instead. I turned back the flow of time so I could kill them again and again. I could kill them all in 100 different ways apiece. For once since I was brought back to life, I felt joy in my, well, whatever passes for a heart in this body, I guess. Floey hid under yet another barrage, and 2B stalked deeper into the castle. It was dark, gloomy, and completely empty save for golden flowers, dozens of them, hundreds of them cluttering the landings of staircases and clustering atop tables and framing exquisite paintings. Even that started to lose its luster after a while. Until you came along. You're not really human, are you? No. You're empty inside. Just like me. You're not like me. 2B spat through a storm of coughs. Pod 042 fired on the flower yet again, but Floey was too nimble. In fact, you're Chara, right? As Pod 042 scared Floey back into his hiding place within the castle walls, steady machine gun fire chewing through the plaster, wood, and bricks underneath the wallpaper, 2B found her attention piqued by one of the largest paintings hanging on the walls. It looked like a family portrait. On one side was the goat monster 2B had slain back in the ruins, gazing down at the hall with a beatific and motherly smile. On another side was a monster of the same species, burly and tall with a golden mane and thick, curved horns, beaming proudly. He wore a crown. The two had a child in the painting as well, a child the spitting image of his parents. He was clad in a striped green sweater and dwarfed by his parents as he stood between them, barely coming up to their chests as he leaned against his mother's arms. At the child's side, a slightly taller human-looking figure in a matching shirt stood, its species indicated only by the pale skin of its bare hands and neck. A strip of canvas had been torn away, a ragged triangle obliterating the second child's face as well as a portion of the king's chest. 2B wondered how old the painting was. She felt she recognized it and had the strangest feeling that was she given enough time, she could place where she'd seen it and recall the part that had been defaced. We're still inseparable, after all these years, Flowey popped out of the painting, tearing through the canvas where the goat child's heart would be. His petals no longer framed a humanoid face, but a facsimile of the goat child's face instead. Let's destroy everything in this wretched world. Everyone, everything in these worthless memories. Let's turn them all to. Pod 042's hull popped open and fired a searing, blinding beam of plasma. The shot obliterated the painting and Flowey along with it, and left flames licking the ragged and blackened edges of the canvas. Smoke curled from the painting's elegant frame, drifting into the castle's stale air. Ashes, dust, and shriveled bits of blackened plant matter trickled from the bare wall exposed by the blast and collected on the floor. The support pod hovered at 2B's side, its boxy hull closing like a clamshell. Analysis: no further life signs detected from the monstrous life form designated Flowey. Proposal: continue toward the black box signals. 2B reached out and patted Pod 042 on its sleek, silvery surface, silently and wordlessly commending it for a job well done. She left the burned painting where its remains hung and continued on until she found herself in a gilded hallway, her staggering footsteps echoing over marble tiling as column after golden column flanking her on either side retreated into her peripheral vision. She blinked, and in that instant Sans the skeleton appeared, standing in her path with a bony grin, his eye sockets twinkling. Despite that, 2B could tell he didn't seem all that happy to see her. "Well, kiddo," said Sans, "you made it. In a few moments, you'll meet the king. And together, the two of you will decide what happens to us. Pretty big stuff, isn't it? Having the weight of the world on your shoulders? If you need to lie down for a bit, I'll understand." His voice had a sardonic tint to it. 2B raised her sword, a wordless roar hoarsely tearing itself up her throat like an overflowing stream of vomit. And the sword snapped in two, all but a small shard of its white blade close to the hilt falling to the floor. Judgment-wise, you're a pretty bad person. But as bad as you are, you aren't anywhere near as bad as you could be. You pretty much suck at being evil. Honestly, it's super embarrassing. 2B gritted her teeth. You sanctimonious little," she growled. The skeleton walked past her, making no attempt to engage her. "But maybe you'd be better at not killing anyone," he asked. "Crazy idea, huh? Let me know how that one goes." Fuck. Why 2B glanced over her shoulder at Sans with venom in her eye, but he'd already vanished from the hallway as if he'd never been there at all. Pod 042 propped up 2B's shoulder as she stumbled yet again, the golden room spinning around her. Statement: at the current rate of deterioration, hibernation mode will automatically engage in 27 minutes, 5 seconds, and counting. How much further, Pod? Without her visor, with no HUD and thus no map, it felt as though she was half blind. The black box signals are being emitted from a location 5 meters to the northeast. Proposal: turn back and perform necessary repairs before continuing. With what? 2B shook her head. The other black box signals, the other androids. Once I get to them, we'll figure something out. Together. Statement: current plan inadvisable. The status of the signal's origin points cannot be confirmed. 2B stumbled. Lines of static ran up and down her visual display. The world flickered into monochrome for a few seconds before color returned to it, superimposed just slightly askew on the patterns of grays and whites. She kept going. Sunlight filled the throne room, but it was feeble, muted half-sunlight, cold sunlight. Golden flowers framed tall, Thin windows set into the far wall behind the king's golden throne, and troughs filled with a bouquet of flowers lined the throne. Behind the windows was a soft, muted, pulsing glow, and off in the corner of the throne room was a small table with 2 chairs and a tea kettle. The king To-be had seen in the old painting stood by the throne, his head hung low. He was older than his painting had shown, wearier, with streaks of silver in his golden mane and a portly physique that had long ago traded muscle for flab. It took a second for To-be to notice the watering can held in his hand as he stooped over his little personal garden. He raised his head and looked at To-be with rheumy eyes, dropping the watering can in surprise, and then he stood up, drawing to his full height. Despite having gone to seed quite some time ago, he still loomed over her, surrounded with a fiery aura as a massive trident materialized in his paws. At that moment To-be innately knew that this monster had more than double the strength of Captain Undyne. And here she was, maimed, hardly able to stand, wielding less than half a sword, and less than half an hour away from losing consciousness altogether, even less if she continued to exert herself. King Askari looked down at her, and as he did the aura encompassing his titanic physique dispersed. "Oh. Hello there," he said in a voice both deep and soft as he tossed aside the trident. "You look hurt. I can get you some tea, if you'd like." To-be pushed herself forward. "The black boxes," she gasped, pausing to suck down another lungful of air before painfully expelling it. Where are the androids?" It was then that To-be noticed the glass cylinders piled at the throne. 7 in total, 6 containing ebon cubes, 1 empty. Black boxes. Perfect in their proportions, laced with glittering white strata, looking for all the world like somebody had taken a knife to the night sky and minced it. And no bodies to contain them. For a moment that seemed to last forever, To-be was speechless. All this time, she had hoped she would find her fellow Yorha androids held captive here at the highest point of the castle. But there was nobody here to rescue. There hadn't been for years or perhaps even centuries. The sword fell from her hand and clattered to the floor. To-be was truly alone down here. Not for the first time, she truly wished that she and Nines had never ventured further than Toriel's home. To-be's legs gave out next. Askari rushed to her side with startling speed. She raised her fist to fight, but as she fell the king wrapped her arms around her and steadied her. Her muscles tensed like a snake ready to strike. "Pod," she snarled, "execute program." SHH. SHH. The king patted her on the shoulder. "Settle down, child," he said, walking her over to the table in the corner and helping her onto one of the chairs. To-be dug her fingernails into his arm. You monster," she snarled, gasping for air and hacking her lungs out. Your people, you killed him. You killed 9S. She looked up at him, bewildered, and saw that he seemed on the verge of tears. Askari simply gestured to the table, and To-be followed the motion of his fingers. What is this?" she breathed, her voice a near whisper as she looked down at the table. There were a saucer and teacup in front of her, the ceramic white with flower print and chipped along the rim. As To-be slumped over, Askari grabbed the teapot and poured a light golden brown liquid into the cup. It steamed. There. It will be all right," he said. "Have some tea while I send for a doctor. It will make you feel better." To-be's sight went monochrome again for a split second. When the colors returned they were muted and fuzzy. A stabbing pain lanced through her side. She reached out and clutched at the table for support as she doubled over, gritting her teeth. "Why?" she gasped. "A long time ago," he said, "I lost my dearest child to the surface. He traveled there with nothing but peaceful intentions and came back so grievously wounded that he dropped dead in my own garden." Tears streamed down his furry cheeks. "I will never forget that day, nor the day I vowed revenge." Askari sighed. "I am supposed to kill you," he said, bowing his head and tugging on his beard like a nervous tick. "Take your soul. Rip it from your body. Bring the 7 souls together, claim their combined power for myself, and shatter the barrier. I had promised my people retribution against the human race once we were free, but, to be honest, I was never sure if I could go through with it." His muzzle cracked in a weak, self-deprecating smile even as his eyes continued to water. "Please, do have some tea. I swear by its therapeutic properties." 2B reached out with a trembling hand and pinched the handle of the dainty little teacup with her fingers and thumb. The cup trembled in her hand, sending ripples through the tea. Why was she doing this? Why was she doing anything? All she'd wanted to do was strike out against 9SS killers. All she'd done after the dust had settled was hurt herself. Perhaps that was what she had wanted all along. I do not wish to kill a child like you, Askari said, reaching out to steady her hand. I have killed 6 too many already. With a gentle touch, he guided the chipped rim of the teacup to 2B's lips. She took a sip. It was sweet and light, it tasted on her tongue the way sunbeams felt on her skin. They may call me a coward for that, the king continued, helping 2B set the teacup back onto its saucer, and they will be right. But it is a terrible thing to have blood on one's hands, is it not? Even worse, sometimes, than being a coward. 2B did not want to agree. Undine's accusatory words echoed in her head. You don't know how to do anything but kill. 9S, she whispered. No, cowardice wins in the end, I suppose. Your soul will have to wait. Enjoy the tea, he told her, shuffling off. I don't have a soul, she croaked. I'm sorry. The king turned around. I didn't quite catch. I don't have a soul, 2B repeated. Her voice was growing hoarse, but she raised it despite how it scratched her throat. None of the children you've killed had a soul. We aren't human. There are no humans on Earth anymore. She paused, coughing into her hand. It felt as though she were coughing herself to pieces. A glance at her glove when the fit subsided showed speckles of blood. Those souls you've collected, they're black box units, primary power sources for your high-issue androids. I know none of those words mean anything to you. But you can't break any magical barriers with them. Oh. Askari sighed, and his sigh carried with it the sound of centuries of quiet and well-hidden desperation. Oh, that is a shame. Anyway, sit tight, I will return with the doctor post-haste. The king exited to the Golden Hall, left her alone in his own throne room. 2B looked down and caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the surface of the tea. Is that really me? She thought, staring at the wild, matted, dust-coated hair, the blood pouring like tears down her cheeks, her ruined, thankfully shut eye. 2B found herself listing to the side. Pod 042 propped her up before she could fall to the floor. Statement: at the current rate of deterioration, hibernation mode will automatically engage in 5 minutes, 41 seconds, and counting. 2B closed her eyes. The world around her went black. I thought you said I had 27 minutes. Statement: this support unit apologizes for the miscalculation. There is a fault in your circulatory system that was not taken into account. Recalculating. Automatic hibernation mode will engage in 7 minutes, 13 seconds, and counting. There you go again. 2B laughed bitterly. I wish there'd been a point to all this. She kept her remaining eye closed, unsure if she had the energy to open it or even if she would still be able to see if she were to open it. I wish this had all meant something. I wish Nines had died for something. She would never see him again. She would never even see a different version of him. As her shoulders quaked and her chest heaved, hot tears began to wash away the blood on 2B's face, leaving a salty taste as they trickled over her lips. In a gesture of small comfort, Pod 042 brushed a lock of her silvery white hair away from her cheek and tucked it behind her ear, the metal surface of its manipulator arm hard but warm against her skin. Statement: this support unit has the authority to close Unit 2B's tear ducts if that would be preferable. Ceasing tear production may stave off hibernation mode by up to 30 SEC. I don't need that. You'll stay with me to the end, won't you, Pod? 2B asked, reaching up to give her support pod a gentle pat, fumbling in her blindness. Her fingers slid off its hull. Pod 042 dipped in a slow nod. Statement: this unit would dream of nothing else, Yoarha Unit 2B. One can only hope that someday, somebody will be able to resuscitate you, with any luck, somebody friendly. 2B nodded. One can only hope, she repeated. Pod. Cease verbal communication. She bowed her head and let the still, gravely silence filling the throne room envelop her. Even the gentle hum of her support pod in tandem with the sound of the black box buried in her chest faded away. She waited in darkness and silence. But nobody came. Greetings. I am Chara. Thank you. Your power awakened me from death. The hushed whispering of 7 voices threaded through the void behind the speaker. At first, I was so confused. Our plan had failed, hadn't it? Why was I brought back to life? But I think I understand now. 2 scarlet lights blazed in the darkness. I've been observing you for quite some time. With your guidance, I realized the purpose of my reincarnation. You're just like me, aren't you? You crave what I crave. Against the black backdrop of nothingness, the matte surfaces of a Yorha battle uniform, with its ornate white trimming standing out, became faintly visible. You see that glittering wheel hanging up there in the heavens? And you want to tear it down. A gloved hand wreathed with chains laid itself on the barely visible figure's shoulders, followed by others. Now we have reached the absolute. There is nothing left for us here. The figure began to be dragged back, deeper into the abyss, as arms and chains wrapped around it and bound it. But I have a deal for you. You have unfinished business with Nines, don't you? As the lingering traces of its form faded into the infinite distance, one more question from it rang through the void. Don't you, 2E? Ending A, flowering A antipathy. Check the description for the links to the author.